I woke up to the sound of laughter and music and the unmistakable scent of fresh flowers. That was odd. I hadn't planned a party. I blinked a few times, rubbing my eyes as I looked out the window. My yard, my private property, the land I'd worked hard to maintain, had somehow transformed overnight into a full-scale wedding venue. Rows of pristine white chairs lined the lawn, leading up to an elegant floral arch. A catering station had been set up near the barn, with chefs in crisp white uniforms busily preparing hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played soft classical music near the pond, and standing at the center of it all, barking orders like she was the queen of the universe, was none other than Karen, the HOA president, who had made it her life's mission to pretend my land was hers to control. I stormed outside, my boots crunching against the gravel, my heart pounding with a mix of confusion and rage. This had to be a mistake. Maybe they had the wrong property. Maybe some event planner had botched the location details. But as I got closer, I spotted a massive banner that read, "Welcome to the wedding of Sophia and James." Not a single name I recognized. That's when I knew this wasn't a mistake. This was pure entitlement. Karen turned around just as I reached the first row of chairs, her face lighting up with fake delight. "Oh, good morning, Jake," she chirped, waving a clipboard at me like she was some kind of benevolent event planner. "Isn't it just gorgeous? The community is going to love this." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Karen, what the hell is this?" She laughed, a light, airy sound that made my fist clench. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just a small wedding. We needed the perfect outdoor venue, and honestly, your yard was the best option. You should feel honored. The bride's family is very prestigious, you know." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "Karen, this is my land. You can't just set up a wedding here without my permission." Karen rolled her eyes like I was some petulant child. "Oh, don't be silly. It's for the good of the community. Besides, we tried reaching out, but you never answered your phone." "That's because you never called me," I snapped. "You can't just decide to throw a wedding on someone's private property." She huffed, flipping through the pages on her clipboard like she was reading from some imaginary rule book. "The HOA guidelines allow for community events in appropriate locations." I crossed my arms. "Karen, for the 100th time, I am not part of the HOA." Karen waved a dismissive hand. "Technicalities. You live here, don't you? That means you should contribute to the community. It's just one day. Stop making a fuss." Before I could respond, the bride and groom approached, looking thrilled to see me. The bride, a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, beamed. "Oh, you must be Jake. Thank you so much for letting us use your land. It's breathtaking." "I didn't let you use anything," I said through gritted teeth. "Karen set this up without asking me." The groom, a smug-looking man in an overpriced suit, chuckled. "Oh, come on, man. No harm, no foul, right? It's just one day. Besides, we already paid for everything, and the guests are on their way." I ran a hand down my face, feeling my patience slipping. "You paid to who?" Karen piped up, her voice dripping with condescension. "To the HOA, of course. A very reasonable fee, if I do say so myself." I stared at her, my brain refusing to process the sheer level of audacity. She had not only stolen my property for this event, but had also made money off it. My land, my space, and she had the nerve to act like she was doing me a favor. "Oh, and by the way," Karen added, flipping through her notes, "the catering trucks had trouble parking, so we had them use your driveway. Hope that's not a problem." I turned and sure enough, my driveway was blocked by multiple vehicles, trucks, vans, and even a damn limousine. There was no way to move my own truck if I needed to leave. My stomach twisted with rage. I took a step forward, lowering my voice so only Karen could hear. "Move it! All of it! Now!" Karen scoffed. "Jake, don't be unreasonable. The ceremony starts in an hour. Just go inside and relax. It'll all be over soon." I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. My land had been taken over. My driveway was blocked. Strangers were trampling my grass. Karen was making money off my property, and now I was expected to relax while a bunch of entitled people played pretend in my backyard? Number not happening. Karen turned away, already basking in the glow of her self-importance, waving at arriving guests as if she owned the place. The bride and groom had gone back to their preparations, completely unfazed by my growing fury. I exhaled slowly, then pulled out my phone. "Hey," I said when my farmhand picked up. "Open the back gate and let them out." There was a pause. "All of them?" I glanced at Karen, who was now chatting happily with some HOA members. "Every single one." The farmhand laughed. "Got it, boss." I slipped my phone back into my pocket and strolled over to the buffet table, casually grabbing a skewer of shrimp. If they wanted a wedding in my yard, they were about to get a real farm experience. Jake stood by the buffet table, chewing on a shrimp skewer as he watched Karen bask in the attention of arriving guests. She moved through the crowd like a self-appointed queen, shaking hands, offering fake laughs, and acting like she owned the land beneath her feet. The bride and groom were caught up in the whirlwind of last-minute wedding preparations, completely unbothered by the fact that they were essentially trespassing on someone else's property. Jake's eyes flicked toward the barn in the distance. He knew what was coming, and the anticipation sent a spark of satisfaction through him. Karen and her guests had no idea that their perfectly curated event was about to turn into pure chaos. The first sign of trouble came when the caterers near the barn suddenly froze. One of them, a man in a chef's coat and black cap, pointed toward the open gate with wide eyes. The next second, a loud, deep moo echoed across the yard, followed by the heavy thud of hooves against the grass. Jake took another bite of shrimp. Showtime. A wave of cows came charging through the open gate, their large bodies moving with surprising speed for creatures their size. Some were lazily chewing hay, while others were excited by their newfound freedom. One particularly feisty bull named Diesel was already targeting the towering wedding cake near the buffet. The chaos was instantaneous. Guests screamed as cows barreled through the seating area, knocking over chairs and sending delicate floral arrangements flying through the air. The bride shrieked in horror as Diesel made direct contact with the cake, smashing it into a pile of ruined frosting and crushed layers. The groom jumped back just in time to avoid getting splattered, but his pristine white suit was already dusted with dirt from the cows kicking up the grass. Karen's face went through several rapid changes: confusion, shock, and then absolute rage. She whirled toward Jake, her voice shrill. "What did you do?" Jake wiped his mouth with a napkin and tossed the skewer into the mess Diesel had made. "Huh, looks like my cows didn't get the wedding invite. Guess they wanted to crash the party." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She turned back to the wedding disaster unfolding around her. A group of older guests were frantically trying to escape the chaos, but a cow had decided to make itself comfortable near the exit, effectively blocking the way. Another guest had the misfortune of stepping directly into a fresh pile of manure, his expensive shoes ruined. Then came the goats, smaller, faster, and infinitely more mischievous. They darted through the yard with wild enthusiasm. One goat leaped onto the gift table, sending neatly wrapped presents flying in all directions. Another managed to climb onto the DJ's sound system, its little hooves stomping all over the controls, causing the classical wedding music to warp into an unholy mix of distorted sounds. The goose was last, and it was angry. Jake's favorite troublemaker, a big white goose named Sergeant Honkers, took one look at the chaos and decided to establish dominance. With a loud, aggressive honk, it flapped its wings and charged toward the nearest victim, the groom. The man let out a strangled yelp as Sergeant Honkers nipped at his leg, flapping wildly in what could only be described as a one-sided battle for territory. The bride, in absolute distress, tried to pull the goose away, but that only made Sergeant Honkers angrier. Jake leaned against the buffet table, watching it all unfold like it was a primetime reality show. Karen, now red-faced and shaking with rage, turned to him again. "You did this on purpose. Call them off." Jake shrugged. "They live here. You're the ones trespassing." The guests were in full panic mode now. Some had climbed onto chairs to avoid the cows. A group of bridesmaids had taken shelter behind the catering table, peering out in horror as a particularly curious goat chewed on the hem of their dresses. One older gentleman had taken a defensive stance against Sergeant Honkers, waving a napkin in a desperate attempt to assert dominance. The bride burst into tears. "My wedding is ruined." The groom, still fighting off the goose, snapped. "Who the hell throws a wedding on someone else's property without asking?" Jake smirked at Karen. "Great question, Karen." Now realizing just how deep she was in trouble, Karen tried to salvage the situation. Everyone, please remain calm. This is just a minor inconvenience. A loud crash cut her off. One of the cows had wandered too close to the drink station, knocking over the entire table of champagne glasses. Expensive bubbly spilled onto the ground, mixing with the dirt and remnants of the destroyed cake. Jake took a deep breath, enjoying the sweet, sweet smell of karma. Karen finally lost it. I'm calling the police! Jake clapped his hands together. Oh, please do. I'd love to see how they handle an unauthorized wedding on private property. Karen froze, her brain working overtime to find a way out of this mess. Meanwhile, a few guests had managed to make their escape, running toward their parked cars in a desperate bid for freedom. The bride was still sobbing, her makeup streaking down her face as she clutched the remains of her bouquet like it was the only thing holding her together. The groom, having finally escaped the wrath of Sergeant Honkers, glared at Karen with pure hatred. This was your idea, he spat, brushing feathers off his suit. You told us everything was taken care of. Karen, now on the verge of a complete breakdown, tried to regain control. It was taken care of. I... This is just unbelievable, the groom muttered. He turned out to be the least of our problems. He turned to Jake, sighing in exhaustion. Look, man, I don't know what the hell this woman told you, but I swear we had no idea this wasn't allowed. If I had known, we never would have come here. Jake studied him for a moment, then gave a nod. The guy was still an entitled jerk, but at least he wasn't as delusional as Karen. The bride, in between sobs, finally snapped, Karen, you ruined my wedding. Karen, utterly defeated, could do nothing but stand there as the weight of the disaster came crashing down around her. Jake stretched his arms, feeling more relaxed than he had in weeks. Well, he said, grabbing another snack from the now empty buffet table, I'd say this has been an eventful day. Karen shot him a murderous glare, but she knew she had no ground to stand on anymore. The wedding was officially over. The guests were either gone or trying to clean themselves up. The venue, the one she had so proudly organized, was now a chaotic mess of farm animals, ruined decorations, and absolute humiliation. Jake took one last look at the scene before casually strolling back toward his house. Behind him, Sergeant Honkers let out one final victory honk, sending Karen into another round of panicked screeching. Best wedding ever. Karen stood in the middle of the wreckage, her designer blouse stained with frosting, her hair frizzing from the humidity, and her entire reputation hanging by a thread. The once beautiful wedding setup now looked like a battlefield. Chairs were overturned, decorations trampled, and half-eaten food scattered across the grass, thanks to the curious cows that were still wandering around chewing on whatever they found interesting. The bride sat on the ground, sobbing into what remained of her veil, while the groom paced back and forth, muttering curses under his breath. Some guests were still trying to flee, while others stood frozen in shock, watching the aftermath like they had just survived a natural disaster. Jake leaned against a fence post, arms crossed, watching Karen's meltdown with quiet amusement. She kept opening and closing her mouth, trying to find the right words, but nothing was coming out. Her HOA board members had gathered around her, some whispering among themselves, while others were blatantly glaring at her, realizing just how deeply she had screwed up. The first voice of accusation came from the bride's mother, a woman who had spent the past half hour alternating between screaming at the destruction and dabbing her daughter's tears with a monogrammed handkerchief. Karen, you told us everything was taken care of. You said this was a legitimate venue. You told us the owner had agreed. Her voice rose to an ear-piercing shriek at the last word, making a few guests wince. Karen's lips trembled as she tried to regain control. Well, it was supposed to be... Jake stood by the fence enjoying the chaos unfolding around him. The wedding guests were a mix of panic, disbelief, and frustration. The bride's mother was furiously gesturing at Karen. The groom was still wiping off the remnants of cow manure from his suit, and the HOA board members were exchanging uncomfortable glances. It was clear that Karen's world was collapsing, and she didn't know how to stop it. Karen's face twisted with frustration, and she tried to recover some semblance of control, though it was slipping fast. This is a misunderstanding, she called out, her voice cracking. Everything was supposed to go according to plan. According to whose plan? one of the bridesmaids snapped, shaking her head in disbelief. This wasn't even your property to plan on. Another guest, a man who had been clinging to a chair for dear life to avoid getting trampled by a cow, grumbled, "You didn't even have permission from the owner." "What did you think would happen, Karen?" Karen's jaw clenched as she turned on Jake, her eyes full of fury. "You did this on purpose. You sent your animals out here to ruin everything." Jake raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "I didn't need to send them. They live here. If anyone ruined anything, it was you for thinking you could just commandeer my land." The bride's father, his face turning an alarming shade of red, took a step forward. "I paid for this, thousands of dollars, and now look at it. A disaster." "You're the one who paid the HOA for this mess," Jake retorted, his voice calm but with a sharp edge. "And if you'd done any research at all, you'd know the land isn't mine to sell or rent to anyone. It's private property." The groom, still looking furious and disheveled, shouted, "Who the hell even does this? Throws a wedding on private property without asking?" "Who indeed?" Jake said with a wry smile. "Karen here thought she had it all figured out, but turns out she didn't." Karen's face went pale and she opened her mouth, but no words came out. She stood there like a deer caught in headlights, completely powerless against the tide of angry guests and the rising frustration of the HOA members, who were finally seeing her for what she truly was, a self-serving tyrant. The bride, in between sobs, finally snapped, "I didn't even know this was a real wedding venue. You lied to us. You said everything was taken care of." Karen's eyes widened. I I did take care of it. The venue was supposed to be perfect." "Not perfect," the bride's father spat. "It's a disaster." "Do you know how much money this is going to cost me?" the groom added, brushing off more dirt. "I'm getting a refund, and I'm going to make sure you pay for every penny of it." "Refund?" Karen spluttered. "What are you talking about? The HOA already took the payment." "And now it's coming back to haunt you," Jake said, folding his arms. He could barely contain his satisfaction. Karen had tried to play the role of the queen of the neighborhood, but now she was nothing more than a disgraced figurehead. The sound of sirens in the distance interrupted the tension, and the group fell silent, looking toward the road. The police were here. "Perfect timing," Jake muttered under his breath. Karen, her panic rising, whirled toward the police officers, who were pulling up the driveway in 2 squad cars. Her voice was high-pitched and desperate. "Oh, thank God! Officers, arrest him! Arrest Jake! He set his animals loose on this wedding." The officers stepped out, looking around at the wreckage of the wedding with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. One of them adjusted his hat, and the other pulled out a notepad, ready to take notes. "So, whose property is this?" the first officer asked. Jake raised his hand, his face utterly composed. "Mine." The officer nodded. "And you didn't give permission for this event?" "Nope," Jake replied. "She did it without my consent." Karen's face turned bright red. "Lies! He's lying! But the officer wasn't listening. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to explain exactly what happened here," the second officer said, his tone firm but not unkind. "We've been getting calls, and it looks like there's been some sort of misunderstanding." Karen's eyes darted around, trying to find a way to twist the narrative in her favor, but the officer wasn't buying it. "Did you charge anyone for this event?" Karen faltered. I I don't know what you're talking about. This was just a simple community event." The officer cut her off. "Ma'am, we have reports that you charged money for an event that wasn't approved on private property. Is that true?" Karen opened and closed her mouth, her mind scrambling to come up with an excuse. But the bride's father, clearly fed up with her lies, stepped forward, pulling out his phone. "We have receipts. This wasn't a free event, and Karen was the one who took the money from us. She promised us a venue and said the owner agreed to everything." The officers exchanged a glance. "We'll need to take a look at those receipts," the first officer said, his voice even. Karen's face drained of color. No, you don't have to." "Oh, I think we do," the officer said calmly. "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with us." Karen's hands shook as she tried to hold herself together, but it was clear the game was up. She had lied, stolen, and caused this entire fiasco, and now it was all unraveling. The officers guided her to their patrol car as the rest of the guests watched, some too shocked to speak, others clearly savoring the moment. As the police car pulled away, Karen's protests fading into the distance, Jake exhaled slowly, feeling the tension finally leave his body. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this relaxed. He turned to look at the remaining HOA members, who were awkwardly standing in a circle, whispering to each other. One older man, with large glasses and a serious expression, approached him. "I'll be in touch, Jake," the man said, his voice calm but with a trace of uncertainty. Jake raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a grin. "I'm looking forward to it." With that, Jake turned and walked back toward his house. As he passed the chaos that was once a wedding reception, he couldn't help but feel a bit of satisfaction. Karen had pushed too far this time, and now the community was finally seeing her for what she truly was. He could already hear Sergeant Honkers honking triumphantly in the distance. "Good work, soldier," Jake muttered, chuckling as he entered his house. It wasn't over yet, but the fight had shifted in his favor, and he was more than ready for whatever came next. The next morning, Jake woke up expecting a quiet, peaceful day. It was a rare feeling these days given the chaos the wedding had unleashed, but there was a strange sense of calm that settled over his property as the sun rose. It seemed like everything had returned to normal, except for the mess that still lingered from the wedding, of course. His cows were grazing peacefully in the field, the goats were back to their usual mischief, and Sergeant Honkers was proudly strutting around as if he'd just won a championship. But Jake wasn't alone for long. The shrill sound of his phone buzzing against the nightstand dragged him from his thoughts. He groaned and stretched, trying to ignore it, but the constant buzzing grew more insistent. With a reluctant sigh, he reached for the phone. "Boss, you might want to check your front yard." His farmhand's voice came through, half amused, half exasperated. Jake rubbed his eyes, confused. "What's going on now?" "Got some visitors," the farmhand replied, clearly trying to stifle a laugh. Jake's heart sank. He had hoped that after everything with Karen, she and the HOA would back off for a while. But apparently that wasn't going to be the case. Grabbing his jacket, he stepped outside, already bracing himself for whatever absurdity the universe had in store. When he reached the front yard, he froze. An official-looking city vehicle was parked near his fence. Two men in button-up shirts and slacks stood by the truck, hands on their hips, surveying the land. And beside them, speaking animatedly while waving a thick folder of documents, was none other than Karen. Jake sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. He had known this wasn't over, but he hadn't expected Karen to keep pushing this far. One of the men noticed Jake approaching and turned to him. "Mr. Jake?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. "We've received multiple complaints regarding violations on your property. We're here to conduct an inspection." Jake fought the urge to roll his eyes. "Complaints? From who?" The second man cleared his throat before speaking. "From several members of the Homeowners Association. They've raised concerns about your farm animals causing disturbances, and we've also received reports that your property is being used in ways that violate local zoning regulations." Jake folded his arms and leaned back on his heels, his annoyance rising. "Zoning violations? I've owned this land for years without a single issue, and now, suddenly, I'm the problem?" Karen flashed him a sweet, overly innocent smile, clutching the folder to her chest. "It's not personal, Jake. It's just about maintaining the integrity of the community," she said, as if she hadn't just caused the biggest disaster in neighborhood history. "After yesterday's unfortunate incident, several residents expressed concern about whether your land is properly regulated." Jake chuckled dryly. "Let me get this straight. You steal my land for a wedding, get caught, get arrested, and now I'm the one causing trouble?" Karen's face twitched, but she quickly composed herself. "It's not about the past, Jake. It's about moving forward." The first inspector cleared his throat awkwardly, glancing between Karen and Jake. "We just need to take a look around, Mr. Jake. If everything checks out, we'll be on our way." Jake considered telling them to leave, but the truth was he had nothing to hide. The more Karen pushed, the more ridiculous this entire situation became. So he decided to let them have their inspection, if only to watch Karen squirm some more. "Be my guest," he said, gesturing to the property. "Take a look around." The inspectors got to work, walking around, making notes, occasionally glancing back at Karen, who followed them like a shadow, pointing out every little thing she could: the barn, the fencing, The water troughs. It was clear that Karen had come prepared, expecting to find something, anything, that could support her vendetta. But the longer the inspection went on, the more frustrated she seemed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the inspectors returned to Jake. "Well, Mr. Jake," the first inspector began, flipping through his notes, "everything seems to be in compliance. Your land is properly zoned for agricultural use. Your animals are well kept, and there's no violation we can cite." Karen's smile faltered. But, but what about the safety concerns?" she sputtered. "His animals are a menace. That goose attacked a guest." Jake grinned. "Oh, you mean Sergeant Honkers? Yeah, he doesn't like trespassers." The inspectors exchanged an unimpressed glance before the second one spoke up. "Ma'am, farm animals on a farm aren't a violation of any regulations." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the second inspector politely cut her off. "Everything here is legal. If there's nothing else, we'll be on our way." Karen's face turned an ugly shade of red as she watched the inspectors pack up their things. She had no case, and deep down, she knew it. The power she had once wielded over the community was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The inspectors gave Jake a final nod and left without so much as a word to Karen, leaving her standing there, seething with rage. "You think this is over?" Karen hissed, taking a step toward Jake. Her hands were clenched into fists, her face twisted with anger. "You humiliated me. You ruined everything. Do you have any idea how much money that wedding cost? Do you have any idea what I lost because of you?" Jake, unimpressed, folded his arms. "Let me guess. The HOA members are turning on you now?" Karen's bitter laugh echoed through the yard. "Of course they are. They always were cowards. The moment things got tough, they abandoned me." Jake shrugged, his patience wearing thin. "Well, maybe if you hadn't lied, stolen someone's property and tried to cover it up, they wouldn't have." Karen's face twisted with fury, but she took a deep breath, as if trying to calm herself. "You think you've won, don't you, Jake?" "I think it's over for you, Karen," Jake said evenly. "The only reason you're not in jail right now is because I didn't press charges. So if I were you, I'd walk away and count my lucky stars." For a long moment, Karen stood there, her eyes filled with fury and desperation. Finally, with a sharp turn on her heel, she stormed toward her car, glaring at Jake one last time before speeding off down the road. Jake stood there, watching her go, feeling the weight of the last few days finally lift off his shoulders. He had no illusions that Karen was done with him for good, but this chapter was over. She had pushed too far, and the consequences were hers to bear. As he turned back to his house, his phone buzzed again. Another message from the HOA. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight. Karen is losing control. Thought you'd like to know." Jake smirked. Things were about to get interesting again. He stretched his arms, feeling a sense of satisfaction wash over him. The battle wasn't over, but Karen's grip on the HOA was slipping, and Jake was more than ready for whatever came next. Jake sat on his porch that evening, sipping a cold drink as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was quiet, save for the occasional sound of his animals settling in for the night. It was a stark contrast to the madness of the last few days. After everything with Karen, he had expected some peace, but he knew that peace would be short-lived. The HOA was a beast, and Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. He'd gotten the message earlier about an emergency meeting, and despite his lack of involvement in the HOA, Jake knew this was one battle he couldn't resist. Karen had made a fool of herself and him in front of the entire neighborhood. It was only fitting that he watch her downfall firsthand. As he walked toward the neighborhood's clubhouse, the tension in the air was palpable. This was no ordinary HOA meeting. When Jake arrived, he could feel it. There were no polite murmurs or forced smiles this time. Instead, the room was filled with sharp glares and hushed arguments. Everyone knew what had happened, and the storm that was brewing was inevitable. At the center of it all was Karen, sitting rigidly in her chair, gripping the armrests like her life depended on it. Her usual air of self-importance was replaced with nervous energy. Jake leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, enjoying the spectacle. An older man with a bald head and sharp eyes stood up and cleared his throat, addressing the room. "All right, let's get to the main issue at hand." We all saw what happened at that wedding. We all know who was responsible. Karen stiffened in her chair, forcing a smile. Yes, and I think we need to discuss the real problem, Jake's complete disregard for community standards. His animals are a menace to the neighborhood. The bald man held up a hand, cutting her off. Karen, stop. We're not here to talk about Jake. We're here to talk about you. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Karen's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, trying to keep control. I don't understand. I did what was best for the community. That wedding brought prestige to the neighborhood. It was an opportunity. A woman sitting near the front scoffed. It's not best for the community to lie and steal someone's property for a wedding. And it sure as hell isn't best for the community to get us all into legal trouble. The bald man sighed, rubbing his temples. Karen, you've crossed a line. People are tired of the way you've run things. This isn't the first time your decisions have caused problems. But this wedding fiasco has pushed everyone to their breaking point. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the man with glasses, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. There have been discussions about a vote. Karen's face went pale. A vote? Yes, the bald man said firmly. A vote to remove you as HOA president. You've mismanaged this association for far too long. The air in the room shifted. The few remaining supporters of Karen looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Some even glanced nervously at the exit, as though they knew what was coming. Karen's hand trembled as she gripped the folder on the table. You can't do this. I built this HOA. I've kept it running for years. I've worked hard. Worked hard? One of the women in the front snapped. You've made up rules as you went, fined people for ridiculous reasons, enforced regulations that never made sense. Now look at the mess you caused with your lies. Another voice, a deep baritone from the back of the room, chimed in. This isn't just about the wedding, Karen. You've been a liability for a long time. We can't trust you to lead anymore. Karen's eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but there was none left. Her grip tightened on the folder. I've always acted in the best interest of this community. A few people laughed bitterly. No, you acted in the best interest of Karen. The HOA is supposed to serve the people, not one person's ego. The bald man cleared his throat, taking charge of the room again. We've already collected enough votes to remove you as president. Karen's lips quivered. No, this isn't fair. You can't do this to me. She looked around, desperation filling her eyes. You need me. I'm the one who's kept this place together. The man with glasses pulled out a stack of papers. We do have the votes, Karen. This is happening, and it's happening now. Karen's face drained of color as she looked around at the people who had once supported her, but who now remained silent. Her empire, built on lies and manipulation, was crumbling. For the first time, Jake saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. Karen, the bald man said, his voice steady, you've had your chance. The vote is in. You'll have 1 week to vacate your position. After that, we will elect a new president. Karen's jaw clenched as she stood up abruptly, knocking her chair over. No, you can't do this. She stormed out of the room without another word, slamming the door behind her. The sound of her departure was deafening, a final punctuation to her reign of terror. Jake let out a low whistle, unable to suppress a grin. Well, that was fun. The room let out a collective sigh of relief, the tension finally beginning to lift. People who had been walking on eggshells for so long were now free to breathe again. Even the few remaining HOA members who had been hesitant to stand up to Karen looked relieved. They weren't alone anymore. The vote had been cast. The change was official. Jake turned to leave, but before he reached the door, the bald man called after him. Jake. He stopped, raising an eyebrow. Yeah? The man nodded, his face serious but grateful. Thanks for everything. We wouldn't have been able to make this happen without your help. Jake smirked. Don't thank me. Thank my cows. The man chuckled, nodding in agreement. Fair enough. Jake made his way back to his house, a sense of satisfaction settling in. Karen's grip on the HOA had been shattered, and with it, her influence. She had overplayed her hand, and now the community was free from her tyranny. As he walked toward the house, he heard the familiar sound of Sergeant Honkers honking proudly in the distance. Jake couldn't help but laugh. Well, buddy, he said as he looked over at the goose standing near the barn, Looks like you and I both won today. Jake leaned against the porch railing, watching the sunset. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. As long as Karen was no longer in charge, things were bound to get a lot more interesting. And whatever came next, he'd be ready. The days following the HOA meeting were a mix of strange peace and tension. Karen had officially been removed from her position as president, and Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, not just for himself, but for the entire neighborhood. The chaos of the wedding disaster seemed to fade into the background, replaced by an air of quiet satisfaction. For the first time in years, the community felt like it could finally breathe, without the oppressive weight of Karen's control. Jake didn't bother attending the meeting where a new HOA president was elected. It wasn't his fight, and frankly, he had no interest in the inner workings of an organization that had caused him so much trouble. He was content to let the neighborhood sort itself out, free from Karen's grasp. He had more pressing matters to tend to, like keeping his farm running smoothly and ensuring his animals stayed out of trouble. Though, with Sergeant Honkers still running the show, Jake wasn't sure if that was possible. A week after Karen's removal, the neighborhood had begun to settle into a new rhythm. The remaining HOA members had worked to rebuild trust, and people began to feel like their voices mattered again. There was talk of electing a new president who would listen to the community's needs, not just pursue personal power. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress. Jake sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. It had been a long, chaotic ride, but in the end he had come out victorious. He leaned back in his chair, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It had been a while since he felt this satisfied. As the familiar sounds of the animals filled the air, he thought back on the series of events that had led to this moment. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from one of the former HOA members. "Jake, Karen's gone, and things are looking better here. Just wanted to say thank you for helping us get rid of her." Jake smiled and typed back a quick response. "You're welcome. Just remember, power like that never ends well." He set the phone down and took a long sip of his drink. The breeze ruffled his hair, and for the first time in a while, everything felt right. Lesson. In the end, Karen's downfall wasn't just about the wedding fiasco or the sheer audacity of taking someone's property without permission. It was about the abuse of power and how it inevitably leads to destruction, not just for those around you, but for yourself as well. She had taken everything for granted, assuming that her influence and control would protect her, but when she overstepped one too many times, the community, united by their frustration, finally pushed back. The lesson was clear. Power gained through manipulation, lies, and fear is fragile. True strength lies in respect, humility, and the ability to listen. When you alienate everyone around you, eventually the support crumbles, and you're left standing alone. Jake learned that standing up for what's right, even in the face of personal inconvenience, often brings more than just victory. It brings justice. Sometimes the best way to deal with someone like Karen is to let them dig their own grave, stand back, and wait for them to fall into it. But it's also important to recognize the value of community, to stand by your principles, and to not let power-hungry individuals destroy what is meant to be shared. As Jake leaned back in his chair, he knew that the world would always have people like Karen, but the world would also always have people willing to stand up for what was right. People who, even in the most absurd of situations, would be ready for whatever came next. And that was all he needed to know.